And there you go. Sorry, I'm just trying to record the presentation. So there you are.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I was going to say I'll try and stay on topic, or rather stay focused in the topic. It's, I think, a really interesting style. I hope by the end of the talk you will agree. And there's a lot to talk about in the style. It's kind of multifaceted. But let's start with the BJCP description. And then we'll talk about foreign extra versus tropical stout and those dark, muddy waters there. And then we'll also compare it to a couple of other related styles, tropical stout versus sweet stout versus Baltic porter. Even Schwarzbier has some similarities. I'm sure for many of you it's his old hat, but what is a stout versus a porter? And if we have time or want to dive into it, some further commercial and cultural context for the style, as well as some discussion of potential recipe design and some recipe resources, should you want to brew your own after this. As for questions, please ask them anytime. I believe there's also some time after, but drop them in the chat as we go so we don't forget as we move along. So I always like to start with the big picture. What is a tropical stout? It shares some elements, history, ingredients, process, and balance with various other stouts and porters. It's very much related to the entirety of the greater stout family, but it is unique in its own right. It's not, it deserves its place in the BJCP, I think, because it's a unique style. And like all styles, it is more than a series of cold beer characteristics. It has a living cultural context. Overall, it's dark, it's sweet, it's fruity, it's moderately strong, and it has smooth roasty flavors. It doesn't have a burnt harshness. Again, in that way, it's more like a Schwarzbier. In terms of aroma, we should find sweetness, which can range from moderate to high in intensity. Roasted grain aromas are moderate to high. Can have coffee or chocolate notes, fruitiness, medium to high. May show molasses, licorice, dried fruit, vinous aromatics in support. Can also show a clean note of alcohol. Pretty much no hops. Diacetyl is allowable at low levels, but I think usually best left out. Very deep brown to black in color. Clarity usually obscured, but large tan to brown head with good retention is desirable. Flavors like aroma follows through on expectations from aroma. Quite sweet, smooth, dark grain flavors, restrained bitterness. The roast can get up to moderate to high, but it should be smooth. The roast character should also be moderated by the sweet finish, the sweet balance of this beer. Moderate to high fruity esters, major style differentiation point from other stouts, can show a sweet, dark rum-like quality from the sugar, from the fermentation. We'll talk more about this later, but careful. This is where the BJCP gets a little bit romantic with some things, and it's a bit like describing the English ales as having ladyfinger quality, right? Using something culturally connected. Perhaps it's more accurate to say that rum can have a sugar-like quality. Little to no hop flavor, medium low to no diacetyl. Medium full to full in body, often smooth, even creamy, may give warming, but again, not hot, solventy. Moderate to moderately high carb, and sweetness levels can vary significantly. If anyone has gotten the classic commercial examples of the Dragon and the Sinha is much more roasty. The Dragon is very sweet to the point where you would be forgiven tasting it blind if you thought it was a milk stout, a sweet stout. The comment here from the BJCP is that it's surprisingly refreshing in a hot climate. And this is usually one of the first comments that people make when introduced to the style. Tropical stout, what that's a winter beer. What are you doing drinking it in the tropics? Well, if you are looking for a way in to understand that kind of refreshing quality, I think an easy comparison is, say, the Starbucks Nitro Cold Brew, right? It's a cold beer, it's refreshing, and that roasty character of either a cold brew coffee or a cold beer helps enhance that kind of refreshing quality, even in a hot climate, right? So it's not so strange as it might seem if you are accustomed to having stouts only when the weather is cold. Originally, these were developed from high gravity stouts that were brewed for tropical markets, becoming popular and reproduced by local brewers using local ingredients, local sugars particularly. Here's, I argue with the BJCP often, argue with the wall, I suppose, because it's not a two-way street, but under characteristic ingredients, it describes it as being similar to a sweet stout, but with more gravity. I think if you're interpreting that, as many would, as meaning that a tropical stout is brewed with lactose, I think you'd be forgiven for that interpretation, but it's quite misleading. In flavor profile, it can be quite similar to a sweet stout, but most people would not put lactose in a tropical stout. It's not an imperial milk stout, if that's, but that wording does make it seem that way. Pale and dark roasted malts and grains, hops mostly for balance, for bitterness, may use adjuncts and sugar to boost gravity. That's quite typical. Typically made with warm fermented lager yeast. In taste, it often does taste like a scaled up sweet stout, a stronger sweet stout. Now, of course, that does depend on how sweet it veers in the balance, but it can also be imperial, similar to many imperial stouts, but lacking the high bitterness, that strong roasty character, and the late hops that we associate with imperial stouts, and lower compared to an imperial stout in alcohol. Much more sweet, less hoppy than an American stout, much sweeter and less bitter than the similar gravity export stout. Here's the vital stats. We're talking 5.5 to 8%, 30 to 50 IBUs, generally leaning on the lower side, so the balance stays towards the sweet. Commercial examples include ABC Extra Stout, Dragon Stout, Jamaica Stout, Lion Stout, Royal Extra Stout, two of which we are fortunate enough to easily get here in Ontario, Dragon and Lion. If you're saying, hey, I haven't seen Lion around, it's because Lion is Sinha in our market. They are the same beer. They are simply marketed under different names in different areas, different regions. This clocks in at 8.8%. Made in Sri Lanka will set you back $3 for a 330 ml bottle. Yeah, easy to find, easy to enjoy. Interesting style often I find when introducing it to people, because it's one that can be hidden in plain sight. Oftentimes, even fans of beer will not be familiar with Tropical Stout, but will have walked past both of these beers many times at the beer store or the LCBO and not have picked it up or not understood the style background. Because I am going to try and, this history of both of these beers is interesting, but because I'm going to try and stick to the plot, I'm not going to get too far into it, but they are both classic examples. So this is an example of a BJCP style where we're in luck. We're not having to struggle and scrounge to find classic commercial examples. So 4 and extra versus Tropical Stout. They mentioned 4 and extra a couple times in the style guideline, especially during the style comparison. One reason why these styles can be a little bit tricky to tease apart is historical. In the Old Testament, if you study the old BJCP guidelines, and recognize the old website, which is still up, it's still migrating. You'll see that in this version of the guidelines, they were both under foreign extra stout, but they had tropical type and export type. The classic examples were the same, with Lion Stout out of Sri Lanka, Dragon Stout out of Jamaica, but it was a subcategory, if you will, as opposed to its own category. And the new updates, they teased those apart, and they gave Tropical Stout its own category. As for export stouts, we do have some nice examples here if you'd like to taste and compare to a Tropical Stout. Again, they tend to be a bit more roasty in balance, and I know that Aaron has described our collaboration version as both export stout / Tropical Stout, because it does have a bit of a roasted edge to it. I think aiding in the balance and perhaps more where the Ontario market is at the moment. But yeah, Henderson's also a good local option. We do have Guinness Extra Stout easily available in the LCBO. And if you're not a huge fan of Guinness, right, which I know not everyone is, it's for all of its myth and legend around Guinness, it's not that robust of a beer. It's fairly easy drinking, right? What does a Guinness clock in at? 4.5, 4.2? It's in similar territory to a light lager, right? It's not a super robust beer, at least for my palate. 4.2%, right? So comparing that just quickly to a Bud Light, 4%. The Guinness Extra, not that much more at 5, but at least in my household, when we get a craving for a Guinness, this is the version we tend to prefer to pick up. We no longer get the Guinness Foreign Extra Stout, but that is still a product that they make. And at the time of writing the current version of the guidelines, according to the BJCP, the Foreign Extra Stout makes up 40% of the Guinness volume brewed around the world. Again, the history is the same. Stronger stouts originally brewed for an export market. More heavily hopped versions of stronger export stouts. Guinness Foreign Extra Stout, originally West India Porter, later Foreign Extra Double Stout, first brewed in 1801 according to Guinness, with extra hops and a distinctive taste. A longer shelf life in hot weather, brewed today in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Again, to a good swath of the world, when they think of Guinness, it is this Foreign Extra version that they think of. Pale, dark roasted malts, again, historically, brown and amber malts, sugar to boost gravity, sounds a lot like a Tropical Stout. And essentially it is. It's similar gravity as a Tropical Stout, but it is drier, it is more bitter, it's more roasty, it has way less of those fruity esters. In terms of balance, it's not as fruity and sweet, it's more roasty and dry. More similar in balance to a dry Irish Stout, a dry Irish Extra Stout, stopping short as being as big as intense as a Russian Imperial. Another closely related style is the sweet stout. English style of stout developed in the early 1900s, again, historically known as either milk or cream stouts, a title legally not allowed in England, but acceptable elsewhere. Of course, this name is derived from the use of lactose or milk sugar as a sweetener. And as the BJCP mentions, it was originally marketed as something of a tonic for invalids and nursing mothers, something that, of course, has been maintained in the myth and legends around Guinness. If you've ever had, or for those who have kids, had their, or had kids themselves, have been recommended Guinness or another stout while lactating, while breastfeeding, with the logic being, I suppose, that because there's milk sugar in it, or in the case of Guinness, there isn't, right? There's just this Guinness is good for you. As we'll see in a moment, that is beyond Guinness, that whole health association. In terms of a sweet stout, it's very sweet, more sweet, less bitter than other stouts, except for the stronger tropical stout, which can often be quite sweet, quite reminiscent of a sweet stout. Roast character tends to be mild, not burnt, like other Irish type stouts. Similar in balance to oatmeal stouts, although with more sweetness. So again, here the roast character is more like that of a Schwarz beer. If you're not familiar with invalid stout, it might seem a little bit crazy, but it wasn't so long ago, a more enlightened age in this country where beer, particularly stout, was considered an important part of a healthy recovery. I remember working for one manager in a restaurant who in his younger days remembered serving stout to patients at a hospital where he worked as a young man. This is one from Carling out of London, Ontario, their stout for invalids. A classic example of sweet stout, again, sometimes hidden in plain sight, is Mackelson's Triple X Stout. I remember first studying the BJCP and being very excited to be able to get that so easily. At the time, the industry's changed so much, and of course, I wouldn't have ever predicted the rise of milkshake IPAs and half of the things that the industry is doing now, but the idea of putting lactose in beer was similarly on par to an oyster stout, putting oysters in a stout, and similarly is rare, at least when I first started in the brewing industry. Now, of course, we're putting lactose in all kinds of things, and it doesn't seem quite so strange. Mackelson is a very interesting example of this evolution and cultural exchange. And again, that history of a health claim. Mackelson for many years had this advertising campaign with the slogan, looks good, tastes good, and by golly, it does you good. First brewed in 1907, of course, contains lactose, brewed by Whitbread, 250th anniversary of brewing in Hythe, licensed across the country. Here's the actor Bernard Miles with that catchphrase. For some years, it has been a ghost brand in the UK, still sold and produced, but without advertising or support. It is now primarily an active living thing in Trinidad, where it is targeted at the golden demographic, young men, with the advertising slogan, King of the Night. So just to get a sense of this sort of evolution, here's a vintage ad. I hope you guys can hear it.
Old Gran Hardy was saying that her old dad hasn't drunk his Mackerson for years. I said, but he has one every night. She says, but he don't drink it, he chews it. He's that partial to the taste. That looks good, tastes good, and it certainly does you good. Mackerson. Beautiful.
So that's with the meme, right? How it started, how it's going. Let's see how it's going.
Something good, something rich, something really. Something max, something up, do you feel me? And my might and my strength, yeah. And the power over those who challenge me, yeah. I know you are stronger, whoa. And you know you go longer. Just live your life day by day. Stand firm and just conquer. Mackerson. That's what I'm talking about. Triple X Stout.
I think this is one of the really cool things about beer evolving and changing as it moves across the world. But a beer designed for sick people and babies now with this kind of marketing and positioning. Again, I wouldn't have predicted it. See it coming.
Like a king. King.
Like a king,
Any case, that is milk stout, which culturally and in terms of general profile, general balance of the style, could be argued as the true sister style to tropical stout as opposed to the export stout. Another candidate for that would be Baltic Porter, which is similar in evolution in that it evolved from these stronger export stouts, but of course in a different region of the world. Danish breweries often refer to them as stouts as opposed to porter. Pardon me. Drank a lot of beer while the video was running, which indicates their historic lineage from the days when porter was used as a generic name for porter and stout. Traditional beer from countries bordering the Baltic Sea, developed indigenously after higher gravity export brown or imperial stouts from England were established. Historically, these would have been ales. Many breweries now make them with lager, just like you would with a tropical stout. Generally, lager yeast is used, cold fermented if using ale yeast, as is required when brewed in Russia, apparently. Debittered chocolate or black malt, like a tropical, like a Schwarz, like a sweet stout, perhaps Munich or Vienna base malt, continental hops, make and train crystal malts or adjuncts, brown or amber malt, common historical recipes. Again, it lacks the overly roasty qualities that we associate with most stouts, instead taking on the roasted but not quite burnt characteristics of a Schwarz beer. Quite fruity compared to other porters, but not as fruity as a tropical stout. We used to have Baltic Porter from Quebec, the Trois Musketeers. I don't know if anyone remembers that. I haven't seen it around in a while. Bellwoods is producing a Baltic Porter, but generally speaking, at least anecdotally, it's a style that's a bit more easy to find in Canada than tropical stout, at least on the craft side. Of course, there's no shortage of tropical stout on the macro side. But yeah, of course, the history here being that there was a thriving trade between St. Petersburg and the porter breweries of London, England, but they weren't going directly there and making no stops in between. They were selling strong, stout porter all along the Baltic Sea. We do have a couple local examples, and maybe one of these is in front of you right now. Paradise Found. They put right on the back, don't expect pineapples. Inspiration pulled from the West Indies, this tropical stout inspires visions of warmer days. This style, as we'll see in a moment, tends to be treated, as we saw that reference to rum, being aged in rum casks, adding coconut, adding pineapple, adding papaya, other tropical fruits. It's analogous to making a Scotch ale with peat smoked malt, right? It's a bit more of a romantic cultural association than a historical aspect of the style. Again, I love, as anyone who knows me or knows the beer that I like to brew, I love beer with all that stuff in it. Please brew them, but again, from a BJCP perspective, enter them in fruited or other, specialty categories. The base style doesn't have these things in it. I was fortunate enough to bend Tanner's ear, the head brewer at Saulter Street, about his thought process and history with this beer, and I'll let him explain it himself.
So, I mean, for us, when it comes to like our version of it or my version of it, we use a combination of Carafa 3 debittered, as well as a little bit of brown malt to kind of bring forward that coffee flavor. Pilsner's the main base malt for it, and then with the combination of the two specialty malts in very kind of low quantities, we were able to kind of hit the flavors we wanted. So we're doing a Demerara sugar addition. And I believe the total percent of the malt bill will be like 5% of the whole thing. So to kind of like backpedal a little bit about me and this style of beer, me growing up in Scarborough, huge West Indian community. So I know that sugar was kind of predominantly in a lot of the baking. So to me, it was just a natural choice, right? The kind of the boot in my ass to kind of brew the beer in the first place was actually there. I'm sure you've heard these radio ads about how craft beer only uses 4 all natural ingredients. I think sugar gets like a bad rap, so that was kind of the defining feature. Was okay, well, we're going to brew a beer using an adjunct, using a sugar, and really kind of showcase that as the key ingredient. It goes in fairly easily. The thing is just adding it very slowly. So it's actually, because of it is like 2 or 3 bags. It's taking the full 15 minutes to actually slowly kind of add it in as the whirlpool is occurring. The first time we ever brewed this beer, I did end up having like a massive sugar plug in the bottom of my kettle.
Oh no.
So, which was ever so fun trying to get out. And the one thing to be aware of too when brewing this style of beer, if you are using a demerara sugar, because it's not fully fermentable, is just being aware that when you're actually taking into account for your gravities. So we measure pre-addition, post-addition, and then we just kind of bear that in mind. Most of my beers finish out around 2.5 Plato. This one tends to be a little bit higher, about 3. Growing up in Scarborough, believe it or not, I only ever really saw Guinness at like St. Patrick's Day. Most of the barbecues and a lot of the stuff I saw was the 2 styles of beer I always saw in terms of stout was Dragon Stout and Royal Extra Stout, which the LCBO doesn't bring that in anymore. So believe it or not, I was more familiar with those styles of stouts kind of growing up, as opposed to, what we consider dry Irish, right? We've been brewing this beer since 2018. The only kind of modifications we made have just been kind of dialing in that sugar addition, so making sure it doesn't stick to the bottom of the kettle.
Yeah.
We've played around with the hops over the past couple of years. Just kind of how we're adding it in the aroma addition, just trying to really kind of accent the malt character to it. Yeah, so when we were first developing the recipe, the first year that we did it, one of the kind of tests I guess we tried was I was able to actually take a couple cases of it and right at the beginning of the spring season and drop it off to the guys I used to play cricket with, so a bunch of Guyanese and Jamaican guys, and when they really liked it, kind of gave me the thumbs up. That was the key that we knew that we kind of nailed it. When we first released it, trying to explain a tropical stout to anybody, the first thing anybody ever expects is like, oh, it's got to be full of pineapple, coconut, tropical flavors. So actually trying to have that conversation with customers, explaining kind of the origin of the beer and why it's so important, that's been a bit of a challenge. But as we've kind of got along, more and more people now know about the beer, so it's a little bit easier. We've even put the descriptor on the back of the can that this beer does not contain pineapple, coconuts, or anything like that. So we always say there's that one kind of prime example of what this style of beer is. To me, Dragon Stout kind of nails it on the head. You know what I mean? If you're brewing this at home and you kind of come close to that, or you need that as a reference, that's a good way to go, or a good way to start, right? Obviously, it's a beer that I'm very passionate about. But it's been a really cool way to kind of introduce different communities to beer. So not only has it been, people coming to the tap room, trying the beer, getting a little more experience in kind of the West Indian culture, but it's also been introducing a lot of West Indian culture to craft beer, which you wouldn't necessarily see.
Whoop. That's the direct link. There we go. It is a seasonal, as is most. There is not a year-round example on the craft side in Canada that I'm aware of. Another example of a seasonal or a one-off, really, I suppose, was Dominion City's Shed No Tears. Great beer, I thought. But we do see examples of this beer across Canada. And not a ton of them, but they are there. McCoy's Contraband out of New Scotland for the Maritimes. Granville Island produced one in their small batch series on the other coast. Another example from BC is Phillips. And they took an interesting approach to the warm fermented lager, or the tropical spin on it, by using Kvike, and also accenting that with Sabro and Azaka to give coconut and tropical fruit characteristics. I'll say that the market kind of embracing the term of tropical IPA has done more to muddy the identity of tropical stout, which was named before we were ever calling IPA tropical IPA. But people definitely expect these kind of tropical flavors now. And Tanner having to do that consumer education about the style is not exactly helped by the commonness of these kind of additions or approaches to balance. Another Ontario example, Market Brewing, Take Me Back Tropical Stout, to which they added 300 pounds of mango. I'm sure that was delicious. I didn't get to pick it up, but again, not to be that pedantic BJCP nerd, but the base style of tropical stout, that would be a fruited tropical stout, right? Out of the prairies, we have Rapid Ascent with their, again, rum barrel aged version. And in America, we see very similar kind of approaches where oftentimes, arguably, coconut, pineapple, this is what the one-off, the brewhouse rarities from Flying Dog version of Tropical Stout had. And these kind of additions of spice, herb, vegetable, fruit type tropical stouts kind of outnumber the examples of classic additions of tropical stouts. So that's something interesting, at least as far as the market has been treating the style. Here's another, Dead Blow, which uses a whole bunch of dates, if I remember correctly. Yeah, stout brewed with dates to dial up that date, dried fruit, dark fruit character. Here's another, this one out of Colorado, and it's brewed with pink guava. Here's one that I find kind of interesting. It's from Puerto Rico, and it's a golden tropical stout. So it is a pale stout, right? It's a coffee. What do you call those? You know, they're still around. I'd say they're maybe more trendy.
White stout.
White stout. It's essentially a white tropical stout, which is an interesting approach to it. For our collaboration version, which I was happy to see many people cracking open a bottle. Brewed, of course, with Aaron of Little Beasts, and this went into the first batch. We use for our sugar addition Jaggery, which is similar to Panela or other unrefined cane sugars. It's solidified, dried in essentially buckets, which is why it's shaped like an outturned bucket. And they come in, even bigger sizes. But they are a pain to dissolve. And part of the inspiration for doing this was, when we talk about tropical stout, I don't know how easy it is to do back and forth with this, but who in this meeting was already a fan or familiar with tropical stout before this evening?
Dragon and Sinha or Sinha for me.
I don't remember ever having a dragon stout or a Sinha, right? The sugars that you mentioned though so far, Victor, like I recognize the sugars. I'm from Guyana myself, so it's funny not having had them, but recognizing them. So like the stouts, that is.
I personally love the style, and I love all stouts, but I used to be fortunate enough to teach a class on tasting on stouts, and I always look forward to Stout Day because I would forget about tropical stouts. We'd work our way through it and I'd be like, oh yeah, tropical stout. And for many of my students in that classroom, oftentimes it was similar to this. A few people might have had it. A few people were very familiar with it. Most people hadn't really heard about it. And they're beer people, like the people in this group right now. It's surprisingly underrepresented, especially considering that here in Toronto, where we, as was mentioned before the meeting, we're fortunate enough to have access to a ton of different cuisines because we have such a great deal of representation of different cultures in the GTA and in Ontario in general. There's a huge Caribbean expat population, especially within Toronto. And you can usually tell if you're in an area that has a significant population simply by going to the LCBO or beer store. If they are stocking Dragon, Sinha, Macassin, it's a good bet that they're being bought by members of this community. But not a single Toronto brewery regularly produces a tropical stout. Not a flagship, not a core brand, not even a seasonal. They're rare even as one-offs. And given the explosion of all the breweries that we've seen in recent years, it's a bit disappointing to see so few of these kind of niche styles being explored. With so many breweries, and this might sound overly critical or throwing shade, but there's a sameness that can affect craft breweries where they're reproducing the model of the other successful craft brewery, and they're essentially making the same kind of beers for the same demographic. Toronto is, of course, very diverse, home to the first and biggest Caribbean fest outside the region itself, perhaps comparable to Waterloo, Kitchener-Waterloo's Oktoberfest. You would think that then perhaps there would be at least one local craft brewery producing a beer for the fest or what have you, but of course we are still famously quite monochromatic in this industry. And yeah, that was part of our motivation with brewing this style. But I think this style is also perhaps ready for more mainstream or primetime acceptance simply because of the palate shift that we have seen with these lactose additions and the rise of styles like milkshake IPAs or pastry stouts, reflective of a palate shift towards a sweeter profile. And a pastry stout is often a sweeter stout with fruity, even tropical qualities. Of course, there is also a socio-political element to this. There has been a recent intensification of efforts and attention paid to issues of diversity in the brewing industry and the marketplace. There has been, as a result of this, a concerted effort on the beer industry looking for ways to further involve Black brewers and the Black community. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of these efforts, including local efforts and the Black is Beautiful campaign. But it remains a difficult and controversial issue, but it is not one that is limited to craft brewers. This is from Budweiser, you know, the mainstream of the mainstream. I won't play the whole thing because it's long.
America has been here before. We are continuously reminded of systemic racism that exists. And sometimes we accept it. Sometimes we accept that the American dream is not for all, that the American dream is only for some. But every once in a while, it's a boiling point, and the people of the country come together to burst open a door and ensure that the American dream becomes more and more equal for all. I wouldn't be where I am today if there wasn't for people in my life that did not accept racism. If I didn't have the people that believed in me and opened the door for me. I didn't want to just be a big-time basketball player. I wanted to be a basketball player so I can use my platform to open as many doors as possible. I now have this opportunity to help open new types of doors, but I know there's someone very special I need to meet to make this happen. Natalie Johnson.
Hello.
I've met presidents, some role models, and I feel just as excited to be able to sit and have this conversation with you.
As I understand, I'm giving you a little bit of training today, and you're a rookie in my field.
I'm a rookie?
Yeah.
I am definitely new to all of this. So if you had to give me your quick answer to what do you do?
So a brewmaster is responsible for the brewing process and quality of all the beers that are made at their brewery.
Simple as that.
Yep.
You know, I had a stereotype of
I hope I'm not doing a disservice to this content.
America has been here before.
Moving so quickly through it, but I'm trying to be conscious of time. But yeah, that is not just a moral imperative. It is a existential crisis, which is one reason why we are seeing even large brewers working hard on these issues. Here is from Beer Canada, which gave this information at a presentation just before the pandemic began. It's a trade organization representing the vast majority of volume brewed, which is another way to say representing primarily macro brewers in Canada. But their data is extremely interesting and important to look at. We see, and we have seen for many years, a trend down. And this is not a new story. It's a slow trend, but it's drips and drabs that are killing us. Since 1980, per capita beer sales in Canada have declined at an average rate of about 1.2%. Doesn't sound like a lot, but you look at that chart, 1980, I'm sure some people were born around that time on this talk today. Between that time and now, you're almost halved, right, in terms of per capita sales. Now that might come as a surprise to you if you're mostly in the craft beer bubble, because this is the story that we tell in the craft beer bubble. The other side of it, the fact that beer sales have grown at an average annual rate of 4.4%. So how does that work? How do we have these two seemingly contradictory stats? Well, it's a bit similar again to coffee, where we tend to think that we drink so much more coffee than our grandparents did, but we don't. We tend to drink less, but higher quality. Our parents, even perhaps not discounting our grandparents, would balk at the price that we're willing to pay for a cup of coffee. Similarly, for a glass of beer. The number of breweries have grown at an average annual rate, and I don't need to tell you this, they've really taken off in recent years. But within that explosive growth, there's this context of an overall industry that is either stagnant or slowly shrinking. And just because this GIF is crazy, I'm going to play it. This is from Bart Watson, who organizes the kind of stats on the American side that we just saw from Beer Canada on the Canadian side. And it is the openings grouped by month. And we can see that really starts to take off around 2000, but wait for 2012. Especially in our context of coronavirus, this map looks like an outbreak map and kind of gives me anxiety. Here we go. That's a lot of breweries. That is arguably too many to be sustainable, at least doing all the same thing. 2016 was the first year that volumes of Sierra Nevada fell by 6.9%, the first decline since their founding, which is another way to say they grew continuously until that point. And they have been stagnant or shrinking since. And there's a lot of factors that play with that. One is, of course, that every small town has several breweries now, essentially. So a large regional brewery like Sierra Nevada struggles with that kind of competition. But again, more from Bart here. We're still seeing growth on the craft side, but it's less growth than what we had before. And to Bart and to many, the big open question is how long this pattern of slower growth, but continued crazy strong openings can continue before something has to give. Closings have ticked up a little bit, but same here in Ontario. A brewery closes, a brewery opens, right? The king is dead, long live the king. The first thing that happens is someone buys the equipment and opens a brewery. So yeah, the numbers and the charts look very similar on the American side. So back to Tropical Stout. What you have here on the industry side is an underserved market. And the example of Carabana, again, is an easy one where it's a huge event, at least it was pre-COVID, and expected to bring in over 1 million tourists. It could be Tropical Stout's time for a great many reasons. We'll see. If you'd like to brew one yourself, if I've convinced you, There's a great many different options with yeast. I'm just going to leave these as links because I am trying to move quickly. Apologies if I'm not doing a service to the content, but we'll get to more during the questions. In terms of those fruity esters, is it the heat? Well, maybe. It's true that heat drives higher alcohol productions, which, if the conditions are right, there's a sufficient supply of oxygen or the yeast has sufficient reserves, it may be able to drive the esterification of those alcohols. But it's also likely the addition of sugar, similar to Belgian, which is known to drive ester production. Good example of this would be maltase. You might be familiar with, maybe not. It's not an enzyme we often talk about in brew mashing. It's used, however, in uncommon double mashes, which is rumored to be the method of major Hefe brewers, where the first mash is a standard mash. The runnings of that mash are used as strike water for a secondary mash, which begins at a low maltase rest to produce glucose, to drive more isoamyl acetate banana production. Alternative is the half mash, made famous by the Weinhafenstein Brewing School in Germany. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, apologies. Process is essentially the same, but the mash is essentially halved instead of doubled, but same idea. The goal is to produce maltose from a saccharification rest and then convert that to glucose to drive more ester production in your Hefeweizen. You're not German, you're not worried about the Reinheitsgebot, just add glucose. You don't have to, you can do that, but you can also just add sugar. So is it any sugar? Well, not just for esters. It's a good analogy again would be Belgians, triples. Triples, you know, are dangerous, digestible, easy to drink, delirium tremens, right? Clocking in at 7.5 to 9.5%. Fin de Mont, a Canadian classic example. An English barley wine, similarly, 8 to 12%. So let's say a 9.5 triple and a 9.5 barley wine, same ABV, but they're going to have a totally different profile on account of that sugar addition in the triple and the all malt grist bill in the barley wine. One is a fireside sipper, one is dangerously drinkable. And it's not just the body that the sugar helps reduce. Sugar helps reduce fusel alcohol production. It's thought to help reduce the higher alcohols as well as increase the production of esters. And this is essentially true across yeast types, but the ester profile produced will be strain dependent. Any sugar addition is going to thin and lighten the body of the beer, help make an 8%, 7.5% tropical stout easy drinking. But different sugar types have different effects, different flavor impacts. Yeast strain, sugar type becomes very important, as does volume, timing of sugar addition. Generally speaking, a late sugar addition to ensure both a healthy fermentation. The analogy there being, you know, you don't serve dessert first if you're trying to get a feast into your guests, right? You add it at the end. Glucose is very easy to metabolize. Generally, a late sugar addition can help ensure that complete attenuation as well as more flavor retention from the specialty sugar. I once had very good luck submitting a Doppelbock that I had bottle conditioned with maple syrup to ensure as much maple character came through as possible. How to brew it? There's lots of options. Here is one that I have been working on in preparation for talks on Tropical Stout. I had made one large batch and split it 4 ways and did a couple of interesting things with it. Most weirdly, new to me, but with this whole oxygen driving sugar production, I whipped the beers with air while they were essentially during the peak of fermentation. both to incorporate the sugars, but also to make sure that there was lots of air in the ferment. I don't know if that really did much, but it certainly fermented out nicely. You can read all the notes on there, and the final recipe that I am recommending. It's a really fun style to brew because you have these variables of what kind of fun thing you're going to do with your yeast, whether it's a warm fermented lager, a kveik, some kind of ale, what kind of sugar you're going to add, how you're going to add it, before you even start talking about grist and etc. Common question, well, can I do it like X, Y, or Z? Yeah, absolutely. That fruity character that Tropical Stout is known from can come from malts, can come from yeast, can come from hops, can come from sugar additions, can come from time, or an interplay of the above, or yeah, from adding fruit. Perception of sweetness can be achieved through special additions, through process, through striking the right balance. Again, I think the style can be really exciting because there are many fun and feasible approaches. But let's take a quick look at a few. You could select a Belgian ale yeast known for fruity esters, like the Duvel strain, and give it sugar, mashing it hot, but no ferulic acid. So you're not going to drive those spicy characteristics. So no wheat, no oats. You could select hops known for stone fruit character and use late for flavor and aroma. Specialty malts, also known for dark fruit character. Perhaps use Munich as a base or dark crystals. Use fruity dark sugars, specialty sugars, even fruit sugars or purees. Purees as a sugar addition. Or hearkening back to the history of the style, you could age or stale a portion of the beer and blend it back in, a process that, according to some rumors, is still used by Guinness. Aging, of course, tends to increase the ribes, the blackcurrant, the cassis character, as well as the vinous characters, the sherry, the dried fruit character, that date-like character, as well as, of course, increasing sweetness by dropping bitterness. Here's just a whole bunch of different links if you'd like to do some further reading on the style. The last one here being just recently published on the history of the style. And that is it. I hope I was in time. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please ask them now.
That's awesome. Victor, thank you so much. I was so impressed. I mean, every time we have a guest presenter or guest presentation, I always think, I wonder what this is going to be like. And I was so happy to hear how in depth that was, and how much history there was to it, to the style that I was unaware of, and it does make me want to brew one. So I wonder if anybody has any questions, or is anybody happy? Did anybody try the beers? I guess that was one of the questions I had. Did you guys try? I know David had mentioned that he had some of the wait so long. I did too.
The wait so long. The wait so long is delicious. I just finished it, and it's it's like very tasty, very drinkable. But at the same time, at 7.5%, definitely packs a bit of a punch. It's a very nice beer. Yeah.
I know Ed's got his hand raised. So Ed, go ahead. What was your question?
I'm a good student. I put my hand up.
You must be a teacher.
Yeah, I wonder where that came from. The presentation was great. I really enjoyed it. I was kind of marking papers on the side though, so if some of this stuff kind of blew past me. One of the cultural things I had heard about the Tropical Stouts was that it has a reputation as an aphrodisiac, and watching that the commercial, the modern Mackeson commercial, really kind of had that vibe to it. It's a style that I used to drink more of when I drank stronger beers. I tend not to drink stronger beers that much anymore because I can't drink so many of them. I like to drink many light beers, but it's definitely a style I will have to go back and revisit when I have a chance.
I'm looking for a link. Yes, I mean, it is funny, the evolution of this style. I'm dropping the chat, which also I'm going to go through the questions in a moment because I don't want to miss them. But yeah, the strange additions to stout start with lactose, right? And move on to oysters, which are of course rumored to be aphrodisiacal. But the one that really comes to mind is the cock ale, which I put a link in there on the chat. Yeah, it was.
Sorry, what was that beer again?
It's chicken ale. And we still, like with Guinness, that's a crazy thing. We like, oh, that's a crazy weird urban legend that they had, but we still do this with chicken soup having miraculous healing properties. At the time, the perception was that the male chicken, the rooster, the cock, was aggressive and masculine, and the whole cockfighting thing, and having a cock ale was considered to be a aphrodisiac beer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beer history gets weird and strange, but it is interesting that this style that was originally developed as a marketing thing for sick people and nursing mothers now being marketed in a, I would agree, fairly sexualized way to young men. And again, the golden demographic, right? Not that dissimilar. Well, it's a different culture. I think instantly recognizable to anyone who's watched a beer ad targeted to young men anywhere, right?
Hey, David, you enjoyed this presentation. You should hear some of his other presentations. Wow.
Oh, I can imagine.
Wow.
Yeah, I can imagine. I know Rob's had his hand up, and so does Bear. So Rob, you go ahead.
Thanks, David. Hey, Victor, what a great presentation. I'll be very honest, I didn't think you could make tropical stouts interesting. But that was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I think everyone else did. So Sandra, who's not here tonight, lives in Scarborough, and I've had Dragon Stout with a number of the folks down in Scarborough. Never really kind of understood the cultural significance of that beer. And I'm really looking forward to scoping out the LCBOs down in Scarborough and seeing what's available, and then trying it out with some of the folks in the neighborhood. Once again, thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation.
My pleasure. And I forgot to do it at the outset, but for all the links and everything, I just dropped a link to the slides in the chat. So feel free to take a look at that if you'd like.
Awesome. Go ahead, Bear. I think you had a question.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, for those that are wondering about Scarborough LCBOs, Morningside and Shepherd, which is where my business is, man, they have the best. It's on Milner, the LCBO. It's right off Shepherd. It's by the Fusion grocery store. Great grocery store if you want to get Indian and ingredients there. Anyways, so my question to Victor is, I've been making tropical stouts now for a couple of years. How do you get rid of the bitterness out of the roasted malt? What I've been doing lately, which has a bit of a success, is I've been using my roasted malts in a coffee grinder instead of putting it through the regular mill. as opposed to maybe doing a cold brew with those. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a fan of the cold brew technique, or even just the topping, right? Where you add the dark malts at the sparge only. You don't let it steep in the mash.
That's the way I do it all the time. But I've been lately doing it with a coffee grinder instead of but I'm a little bit lost as to the amounts I put in. By putting it through a coffee grinder, do I double the amount? Do I lessen the amount, or the same amount?
I honestly, in this trial batch that I last did, I just put it right in the mash, and I was happy with the amount of, because I was using debittered malts.
Okay.
I was happy with the amount of roast I got. I personally, palate-wise, I know that the style should lean towards sweet. I do make them sweet, but I don't want them cloying. And the roast does help balance that a bit. And the style does allow for surprisingly high roast quality. That said, and this is something that I'm sure Eric or someone else could chime in better on. I've recently been, though I don't fully understand it, converted to the cult of water adjustments to get your dark malt to be smooth and rich and soft, as opposed to biting and harsh. And so, I mean, generally carbonates, right? You want to soften it that way. But yeah, that wasn't very helpful.
No. Thanks.
I know Attila. Go ahead, Attila. You had your hand up. So
try using some chocolate wheat and chocolate rye. They don't give you that much of a biting, or a pale chocolate malts. They don't give you that biting astringency of it. That can help you to sort of wind that down.
I love the chocolate wheat.
Mm-hmm.
Full disclosure, we used chocolate rye in the first batch of this at my insistence, and nearly ruined the beer. I think I am done with chocolate rye. We had to. I did a collaboration with a different brewer that never saw the light of day, because we used a bunch of chocolate rye in that too. And I don't know if it's something about the conversion from the, if anyone's ever done a homebrew to commercial scale adjustment, it's weird because things don't necessarily scale smoothly, right?
Unfortunately.
Pardon me?
Unfortunately, they don't.
Unfortunately, they don't. And I'm beginning to suspect that chocolate rye has something about it where in a homebrew pilot batch, it's nice, but at a large scale, I find it becomes like an ashtray, like a, unpleasant, burnt roast. That's just my 2 cents.
Maybe you used too much, you think?
I think I did by using any. I will say that the batch that anyone has in their hand right now, as long as it's not a vintage one, has no chocolate rye in it. That was the first thing we did, was remove the chocolate rye. So it could just be my bias, but I'd say go with the wheat before the rye.
Yeah, we had a question
as well.
Yeah, we had a question come in through the chat from Michael, and he was asking, is export and tropical stout a stronger ABV for more alcohol value for the price, or does it withstand transport better, similar to India Pale Ales?
Both. And I mean, price, when we talk about the cultural elements of this, and as Tanner was saying, with introducing different cultures, not just to the style, but also to craft beer, there, I mean, undeniably, that old expression, right? That export should write a thank you letter to craft, meaning, I'm going to pick on Godspeed because I can never think of another brewery making an excellent Dortmunder. And I know that Godspeed is amazing, but what does their Dortmunder cost for like a can of Dort?
Is it like, I think 350 or 375 maybe? I don't know.
I feel
like
more.
$2. You can buy Dab for $2.20.
You can buy
$2.20.
Yeah, Dab. I was talking about Godspeed though, right? So
yeah, let me quickly Google it. I'm sure during.
I was almost positive it was like 375 or something like that. Usually it's around that.
No, but Dab is a great beer.
I love Dab. It's my go-to beer at the LCBO. I mean, I'll Google it in a second, but I don't know, it's like $2-3. It's cheap enough that I don't know how much it costs. And I've used this beer as a classic example of a Dortmunder export in, I don't even know how many years of teaching BJCP classes.
Yeah, Eric's running in, Victor. He says it's $3.50 a can for Godspeed's Dortmunder.
Godspeed.
Yeah,
that's excellent. That's excellent. I picked a bad example then. Let's see what Dab is at the LCBO. That's actually really good. I got to go to Godspeed. It's $2.25 for a tall can. My point being also, and Godspeed's actually a good example because I'm not calling out any Godspeed. Every beer I've had there has been excellent, but I'm sure without naming names, you have had breweries, local Canadian Ontario breweries that you've had to drain pour. It happens once a year in our tasting classes, minimum. I have never drain poured a Dab in years of drinking it, right? And it's consistently one of the most affordable beers in the LCBO, and it's consistently a very high quality. And it's a similar issue with inviting communities that are already drinking Tropical Stout to come have a craft version. I'm deeply biased. I think it's worth every penny. I think she should be charging more for it. But a bottle of this is, I don't know, what is it, $6? And what was it for that Sinha, right? $3. And it's a high ABV beer, so it's a good value. And that's also just a market reality. Convincing someone to leave the tried and true classic commercial example for something else, which, may or may not be as reliable, may or may not be as affordable. It's an uphill battle, but it's one that's worth doing, and it's one that I think we need to do.
That's a good point. It does happen. I think that I know that's been a comment before I've heard that why should I pay X number of dollars for this when I can go into the beer store or the LCBO and get that, which is the same style for like half the price, right? And I get that, right? But I guess it really does depend. It depends on the individual, etc. Right? So.
Well, I think there's a strong argument for all the other reasons why you'd want to support a local community business, right? There's good arguments to be made there, but again, that sentiment, the craft brewer does the consumer education, convinces people that a Dortmunder export is its own thing, and teaches people what it's about, and then they love the style and they learn they can get it for $2.25 at the LCBO, right?
Yeah, true enough. I think, Victor, that there's clearly, at least from what I've seen in the last less than 30 seconds, many people who've suggested that we want to have you regularly come in and discuss different styles because people really did like this presentation. And I know it takes time and it takes energy and, as research, obviously, but clearly people enjoyed this. The number of members that we had online was in the upper 40s, and I think that's something that's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's unique, but it is good to see because it attracts people. They're interested. They want to hear what you think, right?
Oh, thank you.
Do it, Victor. Do it. Come on. You gotta hear the wrath of Victor. It's really his research and presentations are top notch.
Oh,
yeah.
I'd really like to get more deep in history of Pilsner.
I think these things are really, really good. I think it's obviously people enjoyed it. Like, I mean, I guess maybe people thought, well, Tropical Stout, but once you start hearing it and you start getting into the history of it, and you start tasting the beer, and then you're realizing what you're saying and how it compares to, or what you're tasting in the beer itself, it adds to the whole beer and the presentation, and it just makes it a nice package to have there, right? So clearly people are very happy. They'd love to see you back.
You should do the history. Give them the histories, man. That was good.
Yeah.
I haven't drunk a Sinha, as you call it, for maybe 3-4 years, but I'm a huge fan of it. It just is the same as the Dragon. The Dragon just drank 2 weeks ago. Just a curiosity, the Sinha in South America, we pronounce as Sinha, and that is the name of the lady landlord of a slavery farm.
Oh, so this is in Brazil, right? Because
not just in Brazil, and this whole South America culture is just curiosity.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So if we are in a slavery farm, there is the male owner, and the wife is called Sinha, the name of that beer. Whatever.
Yeah, the HA.
It's still as good.
I know in Portuguese the HA is pronounced with a nya.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So
or you don't pronounce it.
Yeah.
Like if you see Brazilians in Canada here, they don't say house, they say house. In Portuguese is the same.
So Victor, yeah, we definitely. I think it's clear that we'd love to have you back.
Cool. I appreciate the warm reception.
Do it, Victor. Do it.
I have trouble with talking about beer, because especially a style like this, which I think is interesting from a great many perspectives: the process, the history, the context, the flavor profile. I'm glad I didn't turn you off the idea.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. I think what we'll do is I think we'll definitely have to get you back.